Today we are looking at Russia, and we're looking at two chapters, different books each. The first one we're going to look at is from our Democracy and Media book. But what I'm going to go ahead and tell you is that we're going to wait to talk about really the effect media had on democracy in Russia till we get to media beyond the Western world. In this chapter instead, what I want to focus on is two things. One, the elite perspective and theory about media control, and two, our focus groups research from our chapter and the implications from them. All right, so let's start off with this elite perspective of control. So the idea here is that control over media equals control over the values and identities of citizens. Let's say that again. Control over the media equals control over who people are in a country. Right, this is pretty reminiscent of a 1930s media and politics theory called the all-powerful media, where in the 1930s and 40s propaganda for the war efforts was huge, it was massive, and it was theoretically believed that these propaganda messages were effective at controlling what people think. Now, we've gone through a whole lot of decades since then. We've come through theories like minimalist effects theory, where basically people are just consuming media that reinforces their own predispositions, meaning media have not many effects. We also have subtle effects theories in the 1980s and forward, and even to today, where the main three effects of media are framing, priming, and agenda setting. Right, but this control over media and the elite perspective in Russia during the 90s and the 2000s, this reaches far back to the 1930s. Why would politicians in Russia believe this to be true within the past 20 years? And a lot of that has to do with because Russia, for the first time in the 90s, experimented with democracy. And it's about what democracy is and what media in a democratic country are. So, what are some common characteristics of media in a democracy? Well, media should be pluralistic, meaning you have a multitude of opinions, all right? They should also be financially able to succeed on their own. That way it insulates them from government subsidies and potential government influence. They should be influenced or they should not have influence from political parties. They should be able to cover all parties equally. It should be non-biased. You should have journalistic integrity, all right? And media should be a watchdog on the state. Media, basically, in a democracy should be trustworthy. And since, in the 1990s, Russia was transitioning to a democracy for the first time, it was believed that people were going to believe this, going to believe media. And if government controlled media, they would be able to control the values and identities of people. So let's go through the causal mechanisms each of why Russian leaders believe this. So first off, Soviet Union ends. And media goes from just being complete communist propaganda to being open, to being free. And so therefore, media should be able to report on things other than one single party. So this begins to open up trust with people. But also the liberalization of media, media freedom, to be able to seek information from government and publish it. All right, sounds pretty good. Also, the marketization of media, the commercialization of media, meaning media are actually starting to be owned and operated by private citizens, not the government. So once again, moving away from that Soviet era, so it should be more trustworthy. And therefore, if it's more trustworthy and people are watching and consuming it, then government officials believe they should be able to influence what people think and who they are and their values. So that's the idea, that's the connecting of the dots for why Russian leaders believe that control over media equals control over the values and identities of citizens. Now let's jump into the focus groups research and look at just two respondents and what they say about their thoughts of Russian media and what they're consuming. So before we jump into what we see from the focus groups, let's talk about what focus groups are for a moment. Focus groups are a research tool where, generally speaking, you get a bunch of people together, you expose them to different information, Then you separate them, put them behind their own computers to where they're completely alone, and you ask them all the same questions to see variations on their answers when they were presented with the same information. Now, in some focus groups, they may make the information different at some points, just to try and see differences. But in general, that's the idea for focus groups. Now here in Russia, what we have is that these researchers were concerned with seeing what Russian citizens thought about Russian news. So we had two types of viewers, active and passive. Active people actively changed the channel for whatever reason. We're not concerned with those people. We're concerned with the actual people who stayed on the channels and that watched the news. What did they think about Russian news? And we have some pretty interesting findings. We have two viewers here on the slides that I really like their answers, and I think it's representative of a lot of people in Russia. Viewer number one, I do not switch if there's a theme that interests me. I'm interested in how they do it. Do they lie well or skillfully? Will they lie dazzlingly? Will they lie disgustingly or vilely? It's a pretty strong statement right there. What about the second viewer? Even if you don't like something, you have to know your enemies. That is, you have to know how the other side is presented. That's why it pays to stay abreast of things. That's pretty calculating. That's a cost-benefit analysis, really, going on between if you want to know what's going on and you want to know what your enemy is about to do, then it benefits you to pay the time that it costs to consume their news. Even though if you're like viewer number one, who's more pessimistic about it and more critical, and it's just like, this is all lies, it's all vials, but I'm interested to see how they're going to lie. So it's two different reasons already for why you watch it. One is just entertainment, and pessimism. The other is cost-benefit analysis on what your enemy is doing. This is huge. It's huge. Generally, we think people watch news because it's what they like. Here we're seeing, well, that apparently is not at all the case. And we have to think about that. We also have to think about what that means for the elite perspective and the theory on controlling citizens' ideas and values. So, some implications from our findings and the research groups and this elite perspective that control over media equals control over citizens' values and identities. Elites and officials think because ratings are high for their news that people trust their news. But we now know that's false, which is interesting for at least three very specific reasons. And the implications you can spread around the world, potentially. Generally speaking, we think that people watch news that reinforces their own predispositions. We think of the common phrase, echo chambers. People go into their own echo chambers and they stay there. Well, implications from this study is, number one, maybe echo chambers are a phenomenon strictly in democratic Western countries. Maybe we cannot assume echo chambers are everywhere. Number two, it means that many people around the world don't have an option for watching that much different media. Remember, rural people lack access to different forms of media. Therefore, their consumption is very narrow. Meaning, once again, there's not even an option of putting themselves in an echo chamber. They just have to consume what they have available to them. And then number three, in authoritarian regimes, many people are quite aware of the state of media in their country. They're aware of what their government is doing. So we need to start rethinking our ideas about echo chambers around the world. We need to start rethinking about the options that people have as far as which news they can consume versus it's simply not available. And people are a lot smarter than we tend to think they are. And they're a lot smarter than governments take them for. So in short, we're seeing here from this focus group, from these cases, in this case in Russia, our media bubble is starting to have to expand for how we understand how media affect politics or how politics affect media. And we're going to go more up to date and what's going on now with Putin in Russia in our Media Beyond the Western World text in just a second.